Welcome to the third episode of a brand new podcast, the CHC Podcast. I am Anna Jaworski and a heart mom to an adult with a single ventricle heart.
And I am Allison Holmes, and I am a single ventricle heart patient. I'll be co-hosting with Anna today, and I'll be producing the show. I'll be back for the conversation at the end.
Thank you so much. Dr. Bove, you were on my other podcast, Heart to Heart with Anna, and I'm so excited to welcome you to this podcast, the CHC Podcast. Friends, Dr. Edward Bove is a world-renowned cardiothoracic surgeon who's operated on over 10,000 children from all over the world. He has joined the Joe DiMaggio Children's Hospital Heart Institute to work collaboratively with its team of cardiac specialists while continuing on at CS Mott Children's Hospital and the University of Michigan Health System. He's also the head of the Hearts Unite the Globe Medical Advisory Board. I don't know how you had the time to do all of this, but thank you so much, Dr. Bove, and welcome to the CHC Podcast.
Thanks, Anna. Always great to be with you, and I always enjoy it because I think what you and your colleagues are doing is such an important thing for all of the families that are out there with congenital heart conditions, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
I'm so excited because today I have a feeling you're going to teach me a whole lot about the history of congenital heart conditions and CHC surgery. So let's get started. You already have taught me some in us putting together the script for the show. I can't wait to see what else you have to share with us. I am going to be throwing out some names, my friends, of famous people, famous in the CHC world. And Dr. Bove is going to tell us how they were important to the development of the field of pediatric cardiology. This is not in chronological order, I don't believe. So I'm just going to be tossing out some names and you can teach us all about it, Dr. Bove. Let's start with a name that I think probably everybody in the CHC world who's been here for any length of time anyway knows, and that's Dr. Alfred Blalock.
Exactly. I think you go back, it didn't necessarily start with him, but in a way, he really opened the door. Treatment for babies and children with congenital heart conditions is indeed possible. He was at Johns Hopkins, and I think it was, back in the 1940s or something like that, where he was doing research, and his research assistant by the name of Vivian Thomas, who should get a lot of credit for this, they were devising a way in animals to create high pressure in the lungs, pulmonary hypertension, by sewing the subclavian artery to the pulmonary artery to increase the blood flow and the pressure. And one of the pediatric cardiologists, the famous Dr. Helen Taussig, was also taking care of particularly lots of children with tetralogy of Fallot who were hypoxemic, they were blue, and they didn't have adequate pulmonary blood flow. And she went to him and said, let's try this as a surgical treatment for these children. And that's how it all started. Indeed, it's quite a famous picture of the operation of Dr. Blalock doing this with Vivian Thomas standing behind him because he wasn't actually scrubbed in, but making sure everything went right. And it just opened the door as a treatment, not a cure, but as a treatment to increase the blood flow. And how many of these children were now treated is probably uncountable, how they began to do this and afford these children a better life. So indeed, that's really where a lot of the history began.
Right. And nowadays, people have given more credence to Vivian Thomas, and you'll hear, instead of a Blalock-Taussig shunt, which is the term that was used for decades, now they're calling it a Blalock-Thomas-Taussig or Blalock-Taussig-Thomas. I don't know what order, but that's frequently what you'll hear now, right?
Yeah, you do. And I think it's a fair thing to do. And I think the University of Hopkins has honored Vivian Thomas with a picture to signify the incredible contribution that he made as well. Because he actually developed a surgical technique, is my understanding.
And he did it on dogs, that he actually perfected the technique on dogs. And that's why he was able to stand behind Dr. Blalock and, I don't know, be that voice in his ear. About what was going on. I don't know.
Right. Obviously, I don't either. But indeed, that's right. I think he was trying to make sure that everything was done correctly because he was the one that had done, God only knows how many he had actually done in the laboratory. So he really had the technique down pat.
I'm going to throw out a little tidbit that I read about Dr. Helen Taussig. I heard that she was hard of hearing. Did you ever hear that? Yeah, I heard that she was hard of hearing, which I think makes it even more remarkable that she was able to help children who had heart murmurs. I used to be a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing, so I'm always fascinated to learn about people who are hard of hearing or deaf and still make significant contributions, because that's another marginalized population frequently. Okay, so then you recommended another doctor for me to add to this list, who's a doctor I wasn't familiar with, and that's Dr. Mark de Laval. Can you tell us about him?
Well, I can, because he was one of the great influences in my life. And sadly, he died very long ago from conditions that he had. But Mark was an incredibly innovative pioneer in congenital heart surgery, who I think among those of us who are in the field, we really recognize what he did. We go back to the Blalock-Taussig shunt, and Mark was the person who really devised and popularized what is often called the modified Blalock-Taussig shunt, which is the interposition of a small tube of Gore-Tex between the subclavian artery and the pulmonary artery. And that really took over as the main shunt for decades and decades, frankly, and that really replaced the Blalock-Taussig shunt, so that you didn't have to divide the artery to the arm. And it was a technique that I think all of us learned. Mark was also an incredibly innovative surgeon. In many ways, he started and advanced the whole notion of using computer flow modeling to try to design better congenital heart operations, in particular the Fontan operation, where he got together with some bioengineers from Italy and really sat down and modeled the actual surgical result on the computer, so that the computer would then be able to predict what would happen if you changed the way you made your connections or did certain things certain ways to try to create the most efficient circulation that you could in the Fontan circulation, since there's no pump. Just a remarkable thing to do, and made incredible contributions doing that. So he really taught many congenital heart surgeons, myself included, and was someone that I think we looked up to in the more modern era of true pioneers in our field.
It's interesting because when you're looking at the complexity of some of the surgeries you're doing, it requires so much more than just medicine. You're actually looking at physics, chemistry, flow dynamics. It's so much more than probably what you were really trained to do in medical school. Isn't that true?
It's very true. And that's why Professor de Laval had this remarkable ability to step outside of the box and say, now this is what we're doing, but what is our goal here? We're trying to create a circulation that is energy efficient, that does not waste energy making the certain turns and connections that you make in the operating. How best can we learn how to do that? And most surgeons, we didn't necessarily think that way, didn't really cross our minds. And so he had the wherewithal to get the people who were biomedical engineers who knew how to put all this stuff on a computer, get together with the clinicians and work together as a unit to figure things out. He was also an incredible pioneer at looking inward to yourself to understand how to become a better surgeon and how to overcome human faults, mistakes, and wrote one of the landmark papers about when he was starting to do an operation called the arterial switch operation for transposition, how his results were not as good as they should have been, and how he went back and learned and actually had the incredible confidence to publish this and show people, look, I made mistakes, even though I'm a world famous heart surgeon. And now I learned, and this is what I did. And we should not be afraid to do. I mean, I think these are contributions that don't often get recognized, but absolutely should. So he was truly an incredible pioneer.
That's amazing. And what he could publish, what he could share with all of you, gave you a chance to step back and take a more analytical approach to not just what went right, but what went wrong to try and prevent that from happening in the future. It's so complicated. When you look especially at those single ventricle hearts, there are so many different connections. And I'm learning as I get older too, that the human body is not nice, smooth surfaces. it has lots of little areas where eddies can occur and little places where blood clots can form that can totally mess up all the work that you're trying to do. And I think it's interesting how all of you are working together with biomedical engineers and people even outside the field. That was something that I thought Dr. Warnofsky did very well. He brought together a conference talking about disruptive thinking and looking outside the field to fields that you would not necessarily think are related, but actually are because they're trying to solve the same kind of problems.
Dr. Laval looked at the systems we have in congenital heart surgery and how complicated it is, how many people are involved, and how to minimize error and to understand it and to get better as a group and as a team. And again, I think this is something that goes beyond an individual's ego to realizing that this is a complex team and we are all human. And how do we get better to try to achieve perfection, which is always something that's not truly achievable, but is something we should all strive. And Mark was just a perfect example of that.
I don't know if there's a biography out there on Dr. Mark de Laval, but I think there needs to be because he obviously was a very critical element to the development of the field of pediatric cardiology. I know my child had the Gore-Tex shunt in there, so I guess it was a modified BTT shunt, and I didn't even know that.
Right. Yeah. And he really was the one that mastered the technique and popularized it.
Amazing. Dr. Walt Lillehei is a favorite of many of us geeks who read other books about congenital heart surgery in its early days, thanks to a book called The King of Hearts.
Right.
And so a lot of us have gotten a chance to know a little bit about him, but maybe not everybody's read that book. So can you tell us what you know about Dr. Walt Lillehei?
Well, again, before my time, but he was truly probably the king of hearts. He's the man at the University of Minnesota that dared to take on these complex repairs. And if you go back to Blaylock, this was before anybody even thought about doing an actual repair inside the human heart. In other words, we didn't have heart-lung bypass. We didn't have any way to do that. As that began to be developed in the 50s, and Walt Lillehei was the guy who took it on. He was quite a character, my understanding and reading about him, quite a ladies' man, had many human flaws, including, I think, eventually being arrested for tax fraud, as I recall, in reading about him. But he was the guy who dared to do things with the blessing of his chair at the time, who I believe was a man named Owen Wagenstein at the University of Minnesota, but to the incredible chagrin of many others who thought what he was doing was absolutely wrong and cruel, etc. But of course, he was taking things on that had no other treatment and led to essentially certain death. He was the one who was using a human donor to be a pump, if you will. And often the parents, usually the mom, because they're the brave ones, and they would be in the operating room with their child, and he would connect their arteries and veins up to the child's so that they could be the oxygenator and the heart, so that he could actually open the heart of the child to correct the defects. And you think about that, and there's an operation that has a potential 200% mortality because 2 people could eventually die.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't perfect, which is sad. There were some problems, but I think it's amazing. What did I read? That he used that cross circulation 43 times, I think.
I don't know, to be honest, how many, but quite a few times until the actual heart-lung machine then obviously surpassed that.
He was developmental in that as well, if I'm not mistaken.
He did play a role in the research. That's exactly right. The first open heart operation using the machine was actually done in Philadelphia to close an atrial septal defect. But there were a number of people around who were working on different modifications that came to it.
I think that whole history is just amazing. And the fact that, yes, there were mothers, but there were also fathers. And I also remember reading about one case where a perfect stranger went in and did the cross circulation because neither of the parents were able to. And I'm just amazed that somebody would do that. The man was a father himself, and he felt that it was important to try and save this child. And it wasn't even his child. So it just points out to me the ability for human nature to show a great deal of compassion, empathy, and kindness in a day and age where it doesn't always feel that way, does it, Dr. Bove?
Yeah, no comment, but you got that right. But it's interesting to me. I don't think something that Lillehei did is even humanly possible to do today.
Oh, no.
Other restraints and the different issues that we all face. Some of it rightfully, don't get me wrong. But this was in the pioneering age when there was no other treatment. A death, sadly, was the only other outcome. And so any level of success was worth it. But without those kinds of pioneers and people who braved it to do that kind of thing, you wonder where it'd be. It's incredible.
Absolutely. And I think he was a little bit obsessive about his profession. And that's probably not surprising, but he faced some serious medical conditions himself and ended up needing surgery that very well could have taken his life at the time. And I think afterwards he became a little bit reckless. I don't know if I should use that word. Maybe it wasn't reckless, but certainly I think he took on death. And I think he viewed death perhaps differently than the rest of us because he had to face his own mortality in a way at a young age that most of us don't have to. And it's funny about being arrested for tax evasion. What I read was that he was so fixated on all of the projects that he had going on and the things that he would get checks for his services that he would just throw them in a desk drawer. And then later when he needed money, he would go get the checks out. So I don't think he was paying careful attention to his finances at the time. It doesn't sound to me, from what I read, that he was trying to do anything devious, but more maybe a little careless about finances because that just wasn't important to him. What was important to him was saving lives. And I totally get that. Moving on.
Yeah.
You introduced me to another doctor's name that I had not heard before, and that was Dr. Herbert Sloan. And I think once I found out about him, I saw, wow, he really is an important doctor for us to know about that probably doesn't get the recognition he deserves. Wow.
Well, that's exactly why I brought the name up. And again, it's a little bit of my bias because not only on the faculty at the University of Michigan, but I did my residency there when he was actually still kind of an active surgeon. His career was winding down. He was an interesting man. He was a classic old, very gruff surgeon, almost never referred to by name. He just point at you. He wanted you. Interesting guy. First of all, he's the first person ever to repair total anomalous pulmonary venous connection. So that had never been done before. He was the first person to do it. Yeah, interesting enough, that survived. But his real contribution was that instead of palliating many of the heart defects, he directly repaired them in the 1960s. I think that's correct. So instead of doing a shunt for tetralogy flow or putting on a pulmonary artery band for VSD, I'm talking about in a young infant, he directly repaired them. And published that and got tremendous criticism because some particularly very well-known cardiologists around the country, one in particular on the East Coast, was saying how this was terrible because we had safer palliative operations that we could do, openly criticized him. But Dr. Sloan's results were phenomenally good in this area, incredible. And subsequently, when others began to realize that this was actually the preferable way to go, instead of doing 2 operations with risk, you could do 1 at the same or lower risk. He actually got public apologies from some of these people at national meetings and said, yes, you were right. You foresaw this before the rest of us did. And now moving in that direction. So he never got the credit. He was never a person to look for the credit. I don't think he much cared about that. It just wasn't his shtick. But his contributions really, unfortunately, are rarely recognized for the fact that he really changed the thinking to go ahead now that we had the machinery to do open heart surgery relatively safely to go directly and do that. He was an incredibly innovative pioneer in congenital heart surgery.
Wow.
That's why I brought him up, because I think we all know the names of Lillehei and Taussig and Blaylock, etc. But I think the people such as Delaval and Sloan, who really made such major advances in the way we think about things and do things, let alone the innovative things they actually did, should also be recognized.
Oh, I agree 100%.
Tonight Forever by the Baby Blue Sound Collective. I think what I love so much about this CD is that some of the songs were inspired by the patients.
Many listeners will understand many of the different songs and what they've been inspired by. Our new album will be available on iTunes, Amazon.com, Spotify.
I love the fact that the proceeds from this CD are actually going to help those with congenital heart defects.
Enjoy the music.
Home tonight forever.
This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed in the podcast are not those of Hearts Unite the Globe, but of the hosts and guests, and are intended to spark discussion about issues pertaining to congenital heart disease or bereavement.
You are listening to the CHC Podcast. If you have a question or comment that you would like addressed on our show, please send an email to Anna Jaworski at anna@thechcpodcast.com. That's anna@thechcpodcast.com. Now, back to the CHC Podcast.
Now let's talk about some of the early surgeries that were done and why they were significant. And I know we could probably do a whole series just on the history of cardiothoracic surgery. It would be quite an interesting series. So we're only going to have time to do about 4 or 5 of the different eponymous procedures, just because I think they're the ones that are talked about the most. So I'd like to start with the Mustard procedure.
Yeah, of course, that was, again, an absolutely landmark operation. It was done by Dr. Mustard, who was actually a trained orthopedic surgeon in Toronto. But he was an innovative person. He came up with apparently some incredibly innovative orthopedic operations as well. And he did this operation, which sort of goes to show you that what your mom told you was wrong. 2 wrongs can make a right. And so if the arteries are backwards, why don't we make the inflow backwards and then it'll all come out correct. So if you make 2 wrongs, it actually comes out right. So,
oh my goodness.
This was in the era in which the arterial switch just wasn't feasible, wasn't done. So the notion was to do an atrial switch, if you will, and let the blood then reverse itself inside of the heart. He based that again on some research that had been done by others who were working in animal laboratories to shift the way the blood was returning to see if they could create certain kinds of heart defects that could be studied. But then he took that and advanced it and indeed came up with the operation that bears his name. And my goodness, the incredible numbers of babies with transposition that were then saved because there was just essentially no other treatment for them goes without saying. And it remained the standard bearer for treatment until the arterial switch began to take over in the 80s. I guess it would have probably been the 80s that the arterial switch did that. And even then, people criticized people doing the switch when they said this Mustard operation is just perfect. But we now know many years later that other conditions could fall to these children, ventricular issues and the like. But truly a landmark operation by another man who was actually very interesting out of the operating sort of guy.
I read about that. And for February, I did a podcast episode every single day. And one of my guests was Richard Schwindt, and he's an author and a social worker. He was actually operated on by Dr. Mustard. He lives in Canada, and his mother told him he was alive thanks to monkey lungs. I had never, ever heard of that before. I'd heard about Dr. Lillahei using cross circulation, but monkey lungs? I thought he must be mistaken. So I went and looked it up, and yes, indeed, Dr. Mustard used rhesus monkey lungs to help save a handful of children. And this man actually came on my podcast. He was one of the survivors who was alive thanks to monkey lungs before pulmonary bypass was available. Isn't that amazing?
It is. Yeah, there's so many of these things that sometimes get lost in the history. And you think about it, the Mustard operation, or now what was called the Stenning operation, which Aki Stenning, who was a surgeon, of course, in Sweden, who had developed just a different way, basically, of doing the same operation. More difficult technically, but used the patient's own tissues. But now that's really become back in vogue when we now treat complex children with what we call congenitally corrected transposition. And I don't want to get into the weeds too much because it's going to maybe get too confusing. But these patients actually need to have a mustard or sending operation as part of their repair. So although it had fallen out of use for many years and a lot of surgeons came into their training and never got to see it or do it or learn it, now it's actually become popular again for another condition.
Interesting. So the procedure that I believed saved my child's life, it was called the Norwood procedure. Again, another maverick in the world of congenital heart disease. Can you tell us about the Norwood procedure?
One of my favorite quotes of all time was Dr. Norwood's when he said, hypoplastic left heart syndrome is a plumbing problem, a serious plumbing problem. And that's true. And the idea was we just need to change the plumbing around so that we can actually treat these children who are born with the syndrome in which the left side of the heart is simply either missing or too small to be effective. And I think Dr. Norwood, who's an absolutely brilliant technical surgeon, I watched him operate. He was ambidextrous, and I used to always joke myself that I'm ambidextrous because I can't operate with either hand. But he was ambidextrous because he could operate with both, and he was very slick and very good. And he built upon what, again, a number of trailblazers before him had tried to do, but really never could quite get it to work. And he was really the one who got it to work. In other words, did this Norwood operation so that the right ventricle, which was the ventricle that these children are born with and is healthy and is vigorous, could do the work of the left ventricle and pump blood to the body instead of to the lungs. And we know it was possible because your right ventricle at birth is thicker and actually has the ability to do that. In the normal heart, it loses it with time because the right ventricle only has to pump blood to a low pressure, low resistance, so the muscle changes. But if you prevent that from happening, and literally within days of birth, you connect that right ventricle to the aorta and enlarge the aorta where it's too small, the right ventricle essentially functions as the left should have or could do. And then you provide blood flow to the lungs through, guess what? A modified Blaylock dosage.
There you go.
So, how about that? Although, again, there are other ways to do that as well. But here, again, the plumbing was, let's change the tubes around so that we can actually convert these patients to a different type of circulation, because we already knew in this era. I think Dr. Norwood's landmark paper and stuff was around 1980. And I was still a trainee and a resident and really seeing this and getting very excited about what all this was about. But we already knew, thanks to what people like Fontan had taught us, that those children born with an inadequate right side of the circulation could indeed be treated by connecting the major veins, the superior and inferior vena cava, directly to the lungs. I think we can talk about that in a minute. So again, what Norwood and others were doing was that they were swapping that circulation around so that we can actually go into that type of circulation. And so it was incredible landmark achievement that was done as we all changed the face of heart surgery, not just for children with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, but really for many other conditions that were similar and taught many of us how to surgically treat that and to medically treat that, how to balance the circulation and understand the circulation better. Really opened doors tremendously, I think, to newborns, neonates who had very complex heart disease.
It's interesting because when my child was first operated on, I was told that he had a BT shunt and a modified Norwood. And then 16 years later, his fenestrated Fontan wasn't working very well, and he ended up having to have a extracardiac Fontan. And then when I looked at his surgical notes, instead of saying the Norwood procedure, they called it a DKS. And I thought, wait a minute, what's DKS? I had to go look it up. Can you tell us about the Damascus-Stanzel procedure and how that's different from the Norwood?
Yeah, DKS, there were three different surgeons, Damascus and Stanzel, who all came up with this idea pretty much around the same time. But it is, in essence, sewing the pulmonary artery to the aorta to bypass aortic obstruction inside the heart. Again, used in patients mostly with single ventricle. There are some other exceptions, and I won't get into that. So the Norwood operation is essentially doing the same thing. It is taking the pulmonary artery and connecting it, suturing it to the enlarged aorta so that the pulmonary artery, which is taking the blood out of the right ventricle, can pump to the aorta, as I said. So they are in essence the same thing. The DKS was done for different conditions. The Norwood operation includes that type of DKS connection plus the shunt, plus taking out the atrial septum. So it bears the name of Norwood operation because it has a different connotation to it. Mostly different set of patients get that. But they are in essence the same thing, if you follow.
Okay. Interesting. I don't know how you surgeons keep up with all the different names and minute. It seems like very small changes or modifications. And I know everybody wants to leave their mark on the medical field. So to have something bear your name is noteworthy. There should be a Bove surgery. Is there a Bove surgery that I don't know about?
I don't know about it either. We try to come up with very complex sounding names so that we can sound smart.
I dare say you are smart to be able to do everything that you do. But we already started talking about this procedure, but let's talk about it a little bit more. The Fontan procedure. My child would not be here today without this procedure. Like I said, not only had an original Fontan, which was a fenestrated Fontan. It's something different that they were doing in the 90s to try to prevent protein-losing enteropathy, but then had an extra cardiac Fontan. So once again, you all are still finding ways to modify and improve procedures over time. So can you talk to us about that procedure?
Yeah. And again, just to circle back, a lot of that again was the work that Delaval did in looking at the different types of extracardiac versus lateral tunnel versus different ways of making this connection to make the most efficient connection. But Francis Fontan, of course, an incredibly famous surgeon from France. Again, as most of us all do, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and he was building on work and research that had been done by others, most notably Glenn, who was at Yale, and it was connected the superior vena cava, disconnected it from the heart, and connected it directly to the lungs so that you could get the blue blood to get into the lungs. Francis Fontan was looking for a way to treat basically, again, in this era, children who had inadequacies of the right side of the heart. They didn't have adequate right ventricles generally to pump blood to the lungs. The most notable condition being tricuspid atresia, where you could be born and still be alive so long as you had a source of blood to the lungs. What the problem was is that over time, that source of blood to the lungs, which was generally a shunt or maybe a patent ductus arteriosus, something like that, would need to be revised, would need to be updated, or would need to be treated in a different way. And Glenn was one of the people who did the half of the Fontan, if you will. He connected the upper vein, and then Fontan just took it to the next step and basically connected the inferior vena cava to the lungs so that now all the venous blood that was deoxygenated from the superior and the inferior vena cava was directly passing into the lungs to allow what would essentially be normal oxygenation. So this was an incredible landmark thing to do. We know it's not corrective. We don't actually make a new right heart, but it was the best way and remains today the best way to treat children who have one ventricle, be it the right or the left, so that they can have blood flow to the lungs without overworking that one single ventricle. In other words, not having that single ventricle have to pump blood to both circulations, which over time weakens it and causes it to fail, but having it do only what it was designed to do, pump blood to one circulation and have the blood to the lungs because it's low resistance. So that opened an enormous door, again, for the treatment of children who have sound ventricles.
When we were at University Hospital, there were chalkboards in the rooms where they took the parents and explained what was going to happen. And Dr. John Calhoun, my child's surgeon, explained how the heart would have to be modified and what would have to be done. It seemed like magic. It didn't seem like something that could actually be done. It's truly amazing. And now here my child is 28 years old. It really is amazing that it works, and it works well.
And it does.
So another procedure that I don't know a whole lot about is the Rastelli. So can you tell me about the Rastelli?
Again, there's a complex heart defect in which you have transposed great vessels. So your aorta and your pulmonary artery are backwards. But in addition to that, you have blockage to the lungs inside of the heart. So there's a way you can fix that by allowing the left ventricle to pump to the aorta, even though the aorta comes off the right ventricle. And you put in what we call a baffle or a patch. So the left ventricle ejects its blood through the VSD over across into the right ventricle. You then establish a new connection from the right ventricle to the lungs with what we call a conduit, extracardiac. The interesting thing about the Rastelli is that it was devised by a man called Giancarlo Rastelli from Italy, who was a fellow or trainee at the Mayo Clinic. And he was the one that came up with the idea to do this and figured it out. And his teachers, namely Professors Dwight Magoon and John Kirkland, who were famous heart surgeons from that era from the Mayo Clinic, then actually did it in human beings. And it's still an operation we do today. And the very sad thing was that Giancarlo Rastelli died at a very young age, I believe, of a certain type of cancer, and I can't remember what he had, but never got to do the operation himself that he had actually thought of in the past. So it's kind of,
wow.
In many ways, it's a sad story, but a very ingenious idea that he came up with.
Wow. Another procedure that I've heard of recently, and by recently, I mean in the last 10 or 15 years, is the Ross procedure.
Oh, yeah.
And that seems to be something that has also been super helpful. Yeah. Can you tell us about the Ross procedure?
Professor Ross was a British heart surgeon who devised the idea of saying, you know what, if we have to replace the aortic valve in a patient because the aortic valve is leaking or is narrowed or whatever, we have a perfectly good valve right next to it called the pulmonary valve. Why don't we take that out, move it over, and put it in the aortic position? Then we can put an artificial valve in the pulmonary position where it's working at far lower pressure and therefore tolerated very well. And came up with this operation, again, ingenious, frankly, and did it for many years. And it has become an incredibly popular thing, especially for children. Because again, if you think about, take a 3 or 4-year-old whose aortic valve can no longer be treated by anything but replacement, what can you do? You're going to put in a mechanical valve in a tiny child, or first of all, fit. So you have to do some incredible things to make it fit. Second of all, they have to take blood thinners, Coumadin. And can you imagine putting a little child running around doing that? And then they malfunction and fail. Then you can use a animal valve. In a young child, they only last a few years and then they wear out, calcify, and you have to change it. We didn't have a good treatment. The Ross operation allows us to take that child's pulmonary valve, put it in the aortic position, have it function extremely well, and then have to deal with the pulmonary valve because obviously that then needs to be replaced or changed. But at a different level and at a different risk, far less. I've done the Ross operation in newborns. In fact, one patient I love, patient who's only a few days of age, has a Ross operation, is now in her, I think she's 25 or 30. And the same valve is still there functioning perfectly. Never had to have it changed. Now, there are problems with the Ross operation because we know that because it's the pulmonary valve, it doesn't withstand the same pressures necessarily. So if you do it particularly in older patients, it tends to dilate or stretch open and then can develop other issues. But we do have a way to treat that as well. So I'm going to go back to saying what I've often said. We really cure these congenital heart conditions, but we convert them to much more treatable situations where the subsequent problems can be managed easier and safer and give the opportunity for these children and now young adults to live good quality lives. And the Ross operation truly allows that, particularly for young patients who have aortic valve problems.
Are you able to do this procedure without it being open heart? Can you do it in a cath lab?
The Ross operation, no. That's open heart.
No, it does have to be open heart.
But then when you replace the pulmonary valve with let's say an animal valve, a homograph, something like that, you can then replace that years later in the cath lab.
Right.
That's one of the advantages of saving multiple operations. You may not be able to do that forever, but you can reduce the number of operations, you can increase the safety, etc.
Well, this has been fascinating. Dr. Bove, I'm so impressed with the contributions that so many individuals have made. It's like you said, one person seems to grow and step on the shoulders of somebody else to do
Sure.
something even more amazing. And these babies who would have certainly not had a very long life now are living to be adults, and some of them are even having children themselves.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
thank you for your contribution. I know
Thank you.
when I have read articles about you, they say that you perfected the Norwood procedure and that you put your own mark on it.
Well, we were fortunate in that our team at Michigan really started to do it fairly frequently, again, in the later 80s, and able to have reduced the risk and the mortality to very low levels, which many other centers have done, although couldn't match. And so we very quickly grew to now, I think it's something like 1,600 Norwood operations or something. It's an enormous number. It was not unusual for us to do 3 or 4 Norwood operations in one day.
I just can't even imagine that, because when my child had his Norwood, it was an 8-hour procedure.
Yeah, no more. Pretty much. I know for me, I used to make the incision at about 7:30. We were pretty much done by 11:30. And then we'd do a second one. And then in the next room next door, my associates would often be continuing sometimes.
Wow, that's amazing. And that's why people fly from all over the world to have you work on them.
That's why we would have so many. And I think that's part of the whole team knowing, what to do and how to manage it all and becoming so familiar with everything that we were able to do it. Nobody was rushing through it. It's just that this was now so routine, if you could put it that way, that everything gets out and becomes far more efficient, and the results reflect it. And now the survival rate is in the mid 90% range. It's just incredible.
That is incredible, because 28 years ago when my child was born, I was told if my child survived the Norwood, that only 25% of those children made it to age 5. And I think my kid was only given a 5% chance to survive the Norwood, which was horrible as a parent to hear.
I can only imagine, sure.
But 5% was better than 0. And without any surgical intervention, my child had no chance to survive. So we were willing to take it. We had a brilliant surgeon who I think underestimated his abilities. And I think part of that was that he didn't want us to blame ourselves if it didn't go well.
Here is a very important issue. I think in this day and age, with everybody looking at your results and having to report them, which is appropriate, but now so many centers and surgeons are afraid to take a high risk on because it looks bad if it doesn't go well. But then you're denying parents even the small chance that their child will make it. I always felt like it was not our job to say, no, I'm not going to do it because the risk is too high. If there's a reasonable, albeit small, but if there's a chance, why wouldn't you do that and give parents that hope? God forbid, but if things don't go well, give them the ability to have closure.
Right. And to at least be able to say we did everything we could. It just wasn't God's will for that baby to survive is the way I would have looked at it if it would have happened. But how would I have turned to my 3-year-old child and told him that mommy and daddy did nothing? I worried that my 3-year-old would worry that if he got sick, that we wouldn't do everything for him as well.
Not just your 3-year-old child, but how could you look in the mirror? And I don't think that's the way we as physicians should go at it. If there's no chance, that's different. But even if there's a small chance, and that's how we looked at the treatment of hypoplastic left heart syndrome back in the early and mid 80s. We knew that the chances weren't good, or we knew if we didn't try, they'd never get any better. Many parents like yourself said, we want to try. Right. And I may have told you that story of the one patient I had who finally survived to the Fontan, the very first one. The child sadly didn't make it through the Fontan because we did the Fontan at 7 months of age. But the parents wrote me a letter and said, thank you for those 7 months. And we wouldn't have done it differently. Appreciate that. And please keep trying. And it had an enormous effect on me to say, okay, I will, because I'm very depressing to that child.
You all are amazing. And I appreciate everything you have done to contribute to the knowledge base of helping children, particularly with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, although I know you did lots of other procedures aside from that, but I think you're most well known for your work with HLHS.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the kind words, and it's been a labor of love and a great thing to have made some contribution.
Well, thanks for educating me today on all of these other famous doctors and their autonomous procedures. I think that was a lot of fun, and I hope that all of you, I hope all of you enjoyed it as well, friends. I think we need to do this again sometime later and talk about some other doctors, because there is no end to all of the great doctors who are out there helping children survive to adulthood. And now we're seeing new issues come up now that these people have made it to adulthood. We certainly could talk about some of the comorbidities that happen when you have conditions as complex as critical congenital heart defects.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anna.
What a great show, Dr. Bove and Anna. Now we'll take a short break, and then Anna and I will have our own conversation about the episode.
Anna Jaworski has written several books to empower the congenital heart defect, or CHD, community. These books can be found at Amazon.com or at her website, www.babyheartspress.com. Her bestseller is The Heart of a Mother, an anthology of stories written by women for women in the CHD community. Anna's other books, My Brother Needs an Operation, The Heart of a Father, and Hypoplastic Left Heart Syndrome, a handbook for parents, will help you understand that you are not alone. Visit babyheartspress.com to find out more.
This program is a presentation of Hearts Unite the Globe and is part of the Hug Podcast Network. Hearts Unite the Globe is a nonprofit organization devoted to providing resources to the congenital heart defect community to uplift, empower, and enrich the lives of our community members. If you would like access to free resources pertaining to the CHD community, please visit our website at www.hug-podcastnetwork.com for information about CHD, the hospitals that treat children with CHD, summer camps for CHD survivors, and much, much more.
Welcome back. Now it's time for Anna and me to talk about this episode from the perspective of a heart patient and a heart mom. So let's get started.
Okay. Allison, what did you think about the show?
I thought it was fascinating. So interesting to see the perspective from the doctor's side instead of the patient's side. Fascinating information.
That's what I love too. I also love how he knew everybody. You all don't know this because you all are just listening to what's happening, but I always create a script before my show and I share it with my guests so they're prepared. But unbeknownst to Dr. Bove, I threw out a couple of other names because we were having so much fun with the conversation that I just threw out some other people that I thought I'm sure he would know. And of course he did. Without the blink of an eye, he just responded. So I really loved from the host perspective how it truly was a conversation, and we had so much fun talking about all of these different people who, if it wasn't for them, Allison, I wouldn't be talking to you. Mm-hmm. And you wouldn't be talking to me because my kid wouldn't have made it. We wouldn't be friends. And that would be so sad.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that. I thought it was also interesting how when he talked about the surgeons, how some of them were chastised by the other doctors during that era because they felt it was unethical to do what they were doing. How did you feel about that?
Yeah, I remember the scene in the movie Something the Lord Made when Dr. Blaylock was going to do the procedure and the outrage that those doctors, it's never been done. And it's kind of like went against their code of ethics. You can't operate on the heart. So it brought that to my mind. And I imagine many of these doctors did face a lot of backlash from their peers and counterparts due to the risks that they were taking, but nothing risked, nothing gained, right?
Absolutely. And I'm impressed that these doctors held the potential to save life above the certainty of remaining ethical. I'm sure these people weren't saying anything to be unkind. Their conscience was bothered by the fact that there would be pain involved. This was going to hurt those children. And there was no certainty. There was no guarantee that these procedures were going to work. So I understand that one of the biggest parts, or maybe the biggest part of the Hippocratic Oath, is to do no harm. And the doctors have to do harm in order to help. So that's got to be a huge balancing act for people who enter the medical field, but especially when it was such an early time in pediatric cardiology. The thought of hurting those babies must have been horrible for those doctors. And I can understand them chastising doctors that they felt were maybe overreaching. But thank heavens they did, because if they hadn't, we wouldn't be where we are today. So the FDA has come down so hard on doctors. And Dr. Bove said that some of that is even justified. But I think the problem is that now we have to be so careful that maybe we're not having some of the advances that are visible with that look back in time that Dr. Bove and I just did.
Interesting point.
Yeah. So what surprised you the most in this episode, Allison?
Well, I really was surprised about the use of the rhesus monkeys.
Yes.
That was quite interesting to learn about and intriguing. Makes me want to learn more. As a matter of fact, this episode has made me want to research more and read some of the books that were mentioned about the heart surgeons and heart doctors that made these groundbreaking advancements.
The King of Hearts is amazing. Both Frank and I read that, and that talked about Dr. Walt Lillehei. I have Dr. Denton Cooley's book, which I think is called 10,000 Hearts. I haven't read it yet, but I did order it. It's in my library. I am a huge CHC geek. I love to read all kinds of things. In fact, as a Christmas gift, one of my friends got me a book, and I think it's simply called The Heart. And it's all different kinds of information about not pediatric cardiology, but just the heart in general. And I'm just fascinated by all of that. But the monkey lungs, oh my goodness, when Richard Schwindt told me he was alive because of monkey lungs, I honestly did not believe it and had to go do the research myself. I found this great article online devoted to Dr. Mustard. And when I was doing a show every single day in February, I said to Frank, I'm doing a show on monkey lungs. Nobody else is going to believe this. And so he helped me with looking at the research, because it was a medical article, actually, that talked about it. And only 3 children survived with the use of the monkey lungs. And then it was discontinued because they did come up with a pulmonary bypass machine. And I cannot believe that I was fortunate enough to have one of those survivors on my show. I'd love to talk to the other 2 survivors, because I'm wondering what surgery was done on them that also enabled them to survive. I just think it's amazing. And doesn't that show what a little world we live in? Because he was up in Toronto, and here I am way down in Texas, decades later, and able to see the benefit of what had to be probably one of the most unusual techniques that are like little footnotes in the history of congenital heart disease. I find that fascinating.
It is. I thought it was interesting how they took the aortic and they moved it over and used the pulmonary. And how was that? How did that go?
Oh, the
Anna?
Ross procedure.
That was interesting. I can't remember verbatim exactly what they did there, but
yeah, they used the child's pulmonary valve in the position of the aortic valve, because by using the child's native tissue, that valve would actually grow with the child. And then the pulmonary valve would have to be replaced with an artificial valve. And later on, they would have to go back in, but they could do that in a cath lab. So that really prevents further open heart surgery. They can use interventional cardiology going in the cath lab. And it's still painful, of course. They're sticking catheters in a child's groin, but it's much less invasive than open heart surgery. And the recovery time is so much faster, so much reduced risk of infection. And yeah, the Ross procedure was amazing.
Yeah.
That's the one I sprung on Dr. Bove.
Yeah.
That was not in the original script, but He's such a professional. He just went with it. You know what surprises me, Allison? I'm surprised there's not a Bove procedure. That man has been known for decades. As long as I've been involved in the field of pediatric cardiology as a parent, because let's face it, folks, I'm just a mom, I've known of Dr. Bove. He started out just a few years before my kid was diagnosed. And he's so brilliant. And I've had people talk to me from all over the world. The way I first found out about Dr. Bove was when I was putting together my book, The Heart of a Mother. And there was a woman from Singapore who wrote for my book. And she told me she found out about Dr. Bove and she flew from Singapore to have her little boy operated on by Dr. Bove. And then Carrie Van Eck was also a heart mom who wrote for The Heart of a Mother. And her little boy, Jonah, also had surgery with Dr. Bove. So when I was finishing up with the book, I said to the moms, we need to have somebody good write the foreword for our book, because that will give our book validity. It always helps to have somebody well known in the field of whatever book you're writing write the foreword for the book. And I asked the women if they had any suggestions, and immediately Dr. Bove's name came up over and over again. Everybody said, oh, you have to get Dr. Bove. And I said, but I don't know Dr. Bove. And Carrie said, well, I don't think you have to know him. She said, you just tell him I sent you. And she gave me contact information. I was so nervous about reaching out to this great surgeon. I was just a little lowly heart mom. And he was so gracious. That man could not have been more kind to me. He was so affirming with everything. And he wrote such a beautiful foreword and has been so supportive of everything. So my history with Dr. Bove goes way, way back to 1999 when I was working on that book. And ever since then, he's been a guest on Heart to Heart with Anna. And he's helping out with another podcast that I'm hoping to launch next year. We'll see if it comes to be. But we want to do a social justice podcast and look at social justice issues in the congenital heart community. And there's Dr. Bove. He's always offering to help out. And he believes that the parents should have a voice. He's just been such a great support. He's the head of my medical advisory board. Can y'all tell I just love him? I just love this man.
And he mentioned that he was very fond of your work as well. And that's why he supports you. It seems he's very fond of what you're doing. And you're doing a great thing. Let's just say.
Oh, thank you, Allison. I appreciate that. And I couldn't do it if it wasn't for people like you and Dr. Bove. You guys keep me going. And I've loved interviewing you. It has been so much fun getting to know you better. And I'm so excited that you're now part of the CHC podcast as well.
Well, I'm happy to be a part of it. Thank you for joining us today on the CHC podcast. We hope you'll join us next month for our very first town hall meeting, where our topic will be feeling different. Until then, I'm Allison Holmes, and
I'm Anna Jaworski.
Have a great day, and keep those congenital heart conversations going on Facebook and Instagram.
Thank you for joining us. The CHC Podcast can be heard monthly wherever you get your podcasts. Visit us on Facebook or Instagram to continue the conversations. Join the Hearts Unite the Globe Patreon group and become part of our town hall meetings. It's simple. Just visit www.heartsunitetheglobe.org and select the tab that says Donate to Hug with Patreon. Then you too can be part of the conversation.